That night, 17 of the richest people in the city entered Malcolm Voss's private gallery. There were no reporters, no cameras, and no real names on the guest list. Each visitor arrived through a separate elevator, passed 2 guards in dark suits, and handed over a phone at the door. The corridor had no windows. The air smelled faintly of cedar, old money, and chilled champagne. On a silver tray, glasses waited beneath lights so soft they made every hand look careful, and every lie look elegant. They had come to buy a painting the public did not know still existed. It stood alone at the center of the room, covered until the last possible moment, guarded by men who pretended not to listen. The collectors whispered as if they were inside a chapel. Some had museums named after them. Some had lawyers who could erase stories before morning. All of them wanted the same thing: a masterpiece rare enough to be hidden, expensive enough to become a secret, and controversial enough to prove that they belonged in the room. Malcolm Voss watched them with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed value became real only when other powerful people envied it. He had built his fortune buying companies when they were weak and selling them when they were desperate. Art, to him, was cleaner than blood, quieter than factories, and more useful than friendship. A painting could hang on a wall and say everything he wanted said about him without ever speaking. Then a woman in a gray cleaning uniform stepped out from the shadow beside the service door. No one noticed her at first. People like Celeste Warren were trained to move before dawn and disappear before guests arrived. She carried no catalog, wore no pearls, and had no invitation folded in her pocket. There was still a faint line of dust on one rubber glove. Her name was stitched on her shirt in blue thread, small enough that most of the room did not bother to read it. She looked past the guards, past the collectors, past Malcolm himself. She looked at the painting, and then she said, "No one is allowed to sell this." For 3 seconds, the room forgot how to breathe. Then laughter moved through the gallery. A billionaire near the front asked whether she knew where she was standing. A woman in diamonds turned away as if embarrassment could spread through the air. Julian Mercer, the celebrated curator hired to authenticate the work, smiled with practiced pity and told her she should return to her mop before she damaged something she could never afford. Malcolm lifted 2 fingers. The guards started toward her. Celeste did not step back. Her eyes stayed fixed on the canvas as the black cloth was pulled fully away. The woman in the painting sat beside a winter window. One hand folded over the other, blue shadow gathered at her sleeve. The crack in the varnish near the left edge was almost invisible. The small green dot beneath the sleeve was invisible to everyone but her. Celeste felt heat in her throat, although the gallery was cold. She had seen that dot before. She had placed it there with a brush, fine enough to hold one hair. 15 years earlier, she had seen this same painting in a city museum filled with smoke. By sunrise, the world had been told it burned. By noon, Celeste Warren had been blamed. Now the dead painting stood under a billionaire's lights, alive and waiting. She remembered the alarms that failed to ring on time. She remembered the gallery director shouting that the restoration wing was lost. She remembered Julian's hand on her shoulder, gentle enough for witnesses, cold enough for truth. She remembered reporters asking why a young restorer from the wrong neighborhood had been trusted with works beyond her class, as if poverty itself were a solvent that ruined canvas. For 15 years, every door in the art world had closed when she reached for it. Museums did not return her calls. Foundations misplaced her applications. People who had once praised her hands crossed rooms to avoid them. She cleaned offices, polished floors, and learned how to make herself smaller than furniture. But memory had not burned. The guards came closer. Julian's smile tightened. Malcolm's impatience sharpened into curiosity, because rich men dislike interruptions but hate being cheated even more. Celeste raised one trembling hand, not toward Malcolm, not toward Julian, but toward the narrow blue shadow on the canvas. "That mark is mine," she said. "I left it there before the fire." The laughter thinned. Julian took one step forward and said her name for the first time that night. Not Miss Warren, not Madam, just Celeste, spoken like a warning. And in that instant, everyone in the room understood something had entered the gallery that money could not control. The cleaner was not looking at stolen beauty. She was looking at the night that had stolen her life. The silence around her felt heavier than velvet. She kept breathing, because fear deserved no victory. Every careful step carried an old memory forward. Truth had waited long enough behind locked doors. No polished room could make her small again. She remembered, and remembering became a kind of courage. The painting waited, patient and accused. Nothing about that night had truly ended. Her hands were steady, even when her heart was not. The rich owned walls. They did not own memory. The silence around her felt heavier than velvet. She kept breathing, because fear deserved no victory. Every careful step carried an old memory forward. Truth had waited long enough behind locked doors. No polished room could make her small again. She remembered, and remembering became a kind of courage. The painting waited, patient and accused. Nothing about that night had truly ended. Her hands were steady, even when her heart was not. Still. Before the night of the auction, Celeste Warren's days began in darkness. At 4:30 each morning, she crossed the city by train with a cloth bag on her lap and a pair of swollen hands folded over it. The train carried nurses, bakers, warehousemen, dishwashers, and people whose names never appeared on plaques. Celeste liked that hour because no one asked what she had been before. Dawn did not care about reputations. It simply arrived, gray and honest, over stations smelling of rain and metal. Malcolm Voss's estate stood on a ridge above the city, protected by iron gates, cameras, clipped hedges, and the kind of silence money buys from everyone around it. The front entrance faced a long drive meant for guests who wanted to be seen arriving. Celeste used the service door beside the delivery bay. She pressed her badge to the reader, waited for the small green light, and stepped into a corridor where the walls were painted a practical beige no guest would ever see. Her uniform hung loose at the shoulders. The cleaning company had given her 2 shirts, both gray, both stiff from washing. On the left breast, her first name was stitched in blue thread, Celeste. No surname, no history, no hint that those hands had once held brushes made of sable hair and scalpels sharp enough to lift a flake of varnish without disturbing the century beneath it. In Malcolm Voss's house, a first name was enough for anyone paid by the hour. She signed in with the night security guard, a broad man named Ellis, who rarely spoke more than necessary. He liked Celeste because she never complained, never stole food from the kitchen, and never asked questions about who came and went after midnight. That was the official reason. The real reason was that she once noticed his wedding ring had cracked and told him a jeweler could save it before the break widened. People who noticed small damage made Ellis uneasy, but he respected them. The gallery wing required a second badge, and a code Victor Lang changed every week. Victor was Malcolm's gallery manager, a narrow man with silver hair, polished shoes, and a habit of speaking to staff as if each sentence were a receipt. He appeared that morning with a tablet in his hand, and annoyance already waiting on his face. "You are 2 minutes behind schedule," he said. Celeste apologized. She did not explain the delayed train. Explanations given upward often became evidence. Victor opened the steel door with his thumbprint. The private gallery breathed cold air into the corridor. It was not a large room, but it felt endless because every inch had been made to remove accident. Humidity held steady. Light fell without glare. The floor was pale stone, sealed so perfectly that Celeste could see a blurred version of herself moving across it when she pushed the cart. On the walls hung paintings she had only seen in catalogs after the world decided she was no longer fit to stand near them. Victor repeated the rules, as he did whenever an expensive event approached. No touching canvases, no questions about ownership, no looking too long, no speaking to guests, no stepping across the brass line embedded in the floor. Celeste nodded after every rule. She had learned that obedience, when performed well, looked like ignorance to people who needed it to. Victor said, "People like you are here to keep the room clean, not to understand it." Celeste lowered her eyes before they could betray her. Yet when she worked, her mind still moved, as it always had. A varnish layer too glossy on a Dutch landscape told her someone had hidden yellowing instead of removing it. A restored corner on a modern abstract carried a pressure mark from a tool she would never have used. A portrait near the far wall had been relined with fabric too new for its claimed provenance. These observations came without permission. They were not opinions. They were reflexes, like hearing one's own name in a crowd. 15 years earlier, Celeste had been called gifted by men who later pretended they had never known her. She had entered the City Museum as a junior restorer after scholarships, night classes, unpaid internships, and years of cleaning classrooms to afford pigments. Her mother, Lorna Warren, had taken 3 buses after double shifts just to stand outside the museum the week Celeste's first restored panel went on display. "Your hands brought it back," Lorna had whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the painting. The museum was the first grand place Celeste had entered without feeling like a trespasser. She loved the conservation rooms more than the exhibition halls, Because there, stripped of gold frames and flattering light, every masterpiece became vulnerable. Paint blistered. Canvas sagged. Old repairs failed. Beauty needed labor. Beauty needed patience. Beauty needed people whose names were written on forms in storage cabinets, not on walls. Celeste found dignity in that hidden work. She believed she had found a life. Julian Mercer had been the museum's star curator then. He could make donors open wallets by pausing before a canvas and lowering his voice. He wore charm like a tailored coat and used kindness with the precision of a knife. To Celeste, who was young enough to mistake access for respect, Julian seemed like a gatekeeper who might someday open the right door. He praised her eye in private and corrected her pronunciation of artists' names in public. She accepted both as education. The painting that changed everything was called The Woman by the Winter Window. It was not the museum's most famous work, but Celeste loved it more than the celebrated pieces. The woman in the painting did not smile. She sat beside a frosted pane with blue shadow gathered at her sleeve, one hand folded over the other as if holding back speech. The surface had suffered from old moisture damage, and near the left edge, a crack threatened to widen. Celeste spent weeks stabilizing it. On the final afternoon, she added a microscopic green touch beneath the blue sleeve to balance an earlier loss of pigment. It was not a signature. Restorers were not supposed to sign the dead. It was a repair so small no viewer would notice, yet it allowed the shadow to breathe again. Julian came by while she worked. He watched longer than usual and said, "You have a dangerous memory, Celeste. You see what others miss." At the time, she thought it was praise. That night, the museum caught fire. The alarm came late. The sprinklers in the conservation wing failed in one corridor and flooded another. Firefighters saved what they could while staff stood behind barriers, counting frames like missing bodies. 3 paintings from the restoration room were declared destroyed, including The Woman by the Winter Window. Celeste remembered shouting that the storage log was wrong, that the painting had been moved before the flames reached the room. No one wrote that in the report. By morning, Julian told investigators that Celeste had left solvent cabinets unsecured. He did not accuse her of malice. That would have required proof. He accused her of carelessness, which was softer, easier, and more believable when attached to someone without powerful friends. The museum board needed the insurance claims settled. Donors needed reassurance. Newspapers needed a human error. Celeste gave them a face. Within a week, she was no longer a restorer. Within a month, she was no longer welcome. The official letter said her contract would not be renewed. The unofficial message spread faster: do not hire her. She applied to regional museums, university collections, private labs, frame shops, auction houses, and historical societies. Some never answered. Some replied with polite regret. One director took her call and said, almost kindly, "We cannot risk controversy." Controversy meant a woman who had lost everything and still insisted the story was wrong. Her mother died 3 years after the fire. Celeste had been cleaning medical offices at night by then, saving every rejected letter in a shoebox because throwing them away felt like admitting the world had been right. In the hospital, Lorna held Celeste's hand and told her, "Do not let them make you forget what your hands know," Celeste promised. Then she spent the next decade doing work that required hands but punished memory. At Malcolm's estate, memory returned in fragments: the angle of a stretcher bar, the smell of aged linen, the wrong shine of a modern resin pretending to be old. Celeste told herself none of it mattered. Rich collectors bought their secrets, and cleaners survived by not opening locked things. Then Victor ordered her to stay late because a special work would arrive for a private sale. The crate came without public markings. The handlers moved as if carrying a sleeping animal. When the black cloth slipped, Celeste saw only a corner, blue shadow, a dark line, a pulse under the surface of time. Her body understood before her mind agreed. She looked away so quickly Victor noticed. "Are you ill?" he asked. She said she was fine, but the word fine felt ridiculous inside her mouth. Fine was a floor without footprints. Fine was a glass without cracks. Fine was not a dead painting returning under billionaire light. The rest of that day stretched like a wire. Celeste polished the floor, wiped the brass threshold, and emptied bins already empty. Every task brought her closer to the covered canvas. Victor hovered, issuing instructions to florists, caterers, lighting technicians, and security. Julian Mercer arrived in the afternoon wearing a navy suit and the same mild expression Celeste remembered from the hearing that ended her career. He did not recognize her at first. That hurt less than she expected, and more than she wanted. Julian reviewed the painting beneath the cloth with Malcolm and Victor. Celeste heard fragments while coiling an extension cord. Private European collection. Quiet provenance. Exceptional survival. Buyer discretion. The phrases were familiar. In the art world, quiet provenance often meant someone had paid lawyers to make silence look elegant. Celeste kept her back turned, but when Julian laughed softly, the sound carried her 15 years backward to a corridor filled with smoke. She waited for a moment when the room thinned. Near dusk, Victor took a call by the door, and Julian followed Malcolm into the adjoining salon. Celeste moved closer under the pretense of checking the floor. The cloth had been lifted enough to reveal the left third of the painting. There was the window. There was the blue sleeve. There, beneath the fold of shadow, was the green dot no catalog had ever recorded. Celeste's knees weakened. A person can doubt a memory for years, especially when powerful people profit from calling it grief. Celeste had doubted herself in grocery lines, on trains, in the dark hours before sleep. Had she seen the storage log correctly? Had the painting really been moved? Had smoke and panic rearranged truth in her mind? But no one could invent that dot. She had mixed that color herself, adjusting it with the smallest touch of yellow because the original pigment had cooled with age. She went to Victor first, because rules had trained her to report upward. "The painting has a problem," she said. Victor did not look up from his tablet. "The lighting will be corrected before guests arrive." "Not the lighting," Celeste said. "The painting." He raised his eyes slowly. "I am going to assume you are choosing the wrong words because you do not understand them." Celeste swallowed. "That work was recorded as destroyed 15 years ago." Victor stared, then laughed without amusement. He told her the painting had been authenticated by Julian Mercer, whose reputation was older than her cleaning contract and worth more than her apartment building. He told her provenance was a professional matter. He told her people who confused internet rumors with expertise often embarrassed themselves. Celeste said she had worked on the painting before the fire. Victor's face hardened. Not because he believed her, but because an employee had stepped outside the small shape assigned to her. Julian appeared behind him. Did someone say fire? His voice was still smooth, but the skin around his eyes tightened when Celeste turned. Recognition arrived slowly. First annoyance, then calculation, then the faintest flicker of fear. "Celeste Warren," he said. Victor looked between them. Malcolm, entering behind Julian, paused. The name meant nothing to him yet, but the way Julian spoke it made it sound like a door that should have stayed locked. Celeste explained with more calm than she felt. The painting matched a work lost in the museum fire. It carried a repair she had made. It could not be sold until its origin was investigated. Malcolm listened for less than a minute before impatience returned. "Miss Warren, is it?" he said. "I pay experts to protect me from mistakes. I pay cleaning staff to avoid creating them." Julian placed a hand over his heart and apologized to Malcolm for the disturbance, as if Celeste were weather. Victor ordered her to leave the gallery until after the event. She should have gone. Survival had taught her to retreat from rooms where rich men were embarrassed. But as she stepped toward the service corridor, she looked back at the covered painting. Under that cloth sat not only pigment and linen, but the burned remains of her name. She understood then that silence had not protected her. It had only protected them. By the time the guests arrived, Celeste had decided she would speak. The decision did not feel brave. It felt like standing on a platform as a train approached, knowing the tracks had always been there. She waited in the service alcove while the wealthy entered through the private elevator. They gave false names to the attendant with practiced ease. One man joked that secrecy made art taste better. A woman in diamonds asked whether the insurance papers had been arranged offshore. Everyone laughed softly. Malcolm began with a speech about rarity. Julian followed with a lecture about mystery, survival, and the privilege of stewardship. Celeste almost laughed at the last word. Stewardship was what rich people called ownership when they wanted applause. When the cloth came away, the room leaned forward. For a moment, even Celeste felt the old pull of the painting. The woman by the window looked tired, watchful, and alive. Then Julian announced the opening figure, and Celeste stepped out. "No one is allowed to sell this," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the room was designed to carry whispers. Every head turned. Laughter followed, because laughter is the first weapon of people who believe a room belongs to them. Someone asked if she was part of the entertainment. Someone else asked whether Malcolm had begun collecting performance art. Victor moved toward her with a face so white his silver hair seemed dark. Julian smiled. He had used that smile in museums, depositions, donor dinners, and ruin. "Celeste," he said gently, "this is not the place." The kindness in his tone was meant for the guests, not for her. It told them he was patient with instability. It invited them to see her as damaged. Celeste knew the technique because it had worked on her once. She pointed to the painting's left edge. That crack was stabilized with rabbit skin glue and Japanese tissue. The public report never mentioned it. A collector snorted. Julian said restoration methods could be guessed by anyone with a search engine. Celeste did not look away. Behind the left stretcher bar is a patched lining sewn with gray thread. We used it because the museum had run out of the proper linen thread that week. I complained in the conservation log. Julian's smile did not move, but his right hand closed around the catalog. Malcolm noticed. Celeste noticed Malcolm noticing. Victor summoned guards. They took Celeste by the arms, not roughly enough to offend the guests, but firmly enough to remind her of cost. As they pulled her toward the door, she said to Malcolm, "You are selling a painting that was declared dead in the fire that destroyed my career." That sentence did what politeness could not. It made Malcolm Voss think about liability. His face changed almost imperceptibly. The guards stopped when he lifted one finger. The room waited. Malcolm asked the guests to enjoy drinks in the adjoining salon while a minor procedural concern was addressed. Rich people understand coded language. They gathered their surprise, their irritation, and their hunger for scandal, then moved away reluctantly. Julian protested that delay could jeopardize buyer confidence. Malcolm turned to him. "Buyer confidence is less fragile than prison," he said quietly. It was the first useful thing Celeste had heard him say. They brought Celeste into a smaller viewing room with no windows and one table under a white lamp. Malcolm stood at the head of it. Victor hovered by the door. Julian remained near the painting, as if proximity could keep ownership in place. Malcolm asked Celeste what she wanted. The question revealed him. He assumed every interruption had a price. Celeste said she wanted the sale stopped and the museum notified. Malcolm's expression cooled. That is not an answer people usually give. Celeste told him enough of her history to explain the claim. She had worked in conservation. She had restored the woman by the winter window. The painting was listed among works destroyed in the city museum fire 15 years earlier. Julian had testified against her. The official record blamed her negligence. She had no reason to invent a story that would drag that shame into a room full of people paid to remember it. Victor said shame often made people irrational. Celeste ignored him. Malcolm asked for proof. Celeste described the patched lining, the green adjustment under the sleeve, the hairline crack near the left border, and a shallow knife mark on the back frame where a previous restorer had cut too close while removing old tape. These details were not in catalogs because conservation reports had been sealed with the insurance file. Julian said old memories distort. Celeste answered, "Paintings distort, reports distort, hands remember." Malcolm ordered the frame inspected. Julian objected instantly. The work was delicate. The humidity was calibrated. The buyers would lose confidence. Opening a frame during an active sale would be reckless. Each objection sounded reasonable until placed beside the fear beneath it. Malcolm watched him for a long moment and told Victor to bring gloves, a camera, and the independent condition examiner waiting downstairs. Victor looked as if the floor had shifted under him. The examiner, an older woman named Dr. Anika Rao, arrived with a case of tools and the exhausted patience of someone often called only when rich men stop trusting one another. She did not know Celeste. That helped. She listened, photographed the edges, and asked everyone except her assistant to step back. Julian tried to supervise. Rao told him, without looking up, that hovering was bad for both art and credibility. Celeste almost smiled. When the backing board was loosened, the room seemed to shrink. Malcolm folded his arms. Victor held his breath. Julian looked toward the door. Beneath the left stretcher bar lay a patch of lining sewn with gray thread, exactly where Celeste said it would be. Dr. Rao lifted her head and asked how the cleaner knew that. No one answered. Malcolm turned to Celeste, and for the first time his eyes did not slide over the uniform. They stopped at her face. The discovery did not clear Celeste. It did something more dangerous. It made doubt respectable. Malcolm sent the guests home with a promise of rescheduling. Julian argued until Malcolm's voice sharpened. "If this is nothing, it will remain nothing tomorrow," he said. "If it is something, I would rather learn before I sell stolen property to someone who records conversations for sport." The guests left angry, fascinated, and already deciding how to retell the story without admitting they had been fooled. Celeste expected to be dismissed. Instead, Malcolm told Ellis to escort her to the staff lounge and keep her available. Available was not free. Available meant contained. Still, as she sat at a metal table beneath a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary, Celeste felt something unfamiliar move through her. Not hope. Hope was too soft. This was a crack in a wall she had been pressing against for 15 years. Julian found her there after midnight. He entered without knocking, closed the door, and dropped the smile. "You have no idea what you are touching," he said. Celeste looked at the man who had spoken her name into disgrace and saw that age had made him smoother, not softer. He told her the art world had forgotten her for a reason. He told her Malcolm would protect himself before protecting a former restorer with a file full of suspicion. He told her to accept whatever money came and disappear. "Was the fire arranged?" Celeste asked. Julian laughed once. "You always did want stories to have moral structure." He moved closer. "Listen carefully. If you force this open, they will not see a whistleblower. They will see the woman blamed for a museum fire trying to rewrite history because she cleans floors now. I will not need to destroy you. I will only need to remind them." Then he left, and the vending machine light flickered over the table like a failing alarm. Celeste did not sleep that night. She returned to her apartment, a narrow fourth-floor walk-up above a closed tailor shop, and opened the shoebox beneath her bed. Inside were old articles, rejection letters, a cracked museum badge, a pair of white cotton gloves gone yellow at the fingertips, and a photograph of her mother outside the museum. Lorna's smile in that picture still believed the world rewarded care. Celeste touched the photo and felt grief rise, not as weakness, but as witness. In the morning, Malcolm's legal team called. They offered transport back to the estate, a non-disclosure agreement, and compensation for her time. Compensation was a word that made silence sound professional. Celeste asked whether the museum had been notified. The lawyer paused too long. Then he said the matter was still being assessed internally. Internally meant privately. Privately meant controlled. Controlled meant buried. Celeste went anyway because the painting remained there, and because walking away would return the story to men who had already proven what they did with closed rooms. At the estate, she found Malcolm in the gallery with Dr. Rao and Julian. The painting had been lowered onto a padded examination table. Under angled light, the surface revealed more than it had under theatrical glow. Celeste saw a newer varnish layer spread like a lie over older wounds. Dr. Rao confirmed that portions of the work had been cleaned and revarnished after the supposed fire. Malcolm asked whether the painting could still have survived in damaged condition and entered a private collection legitimately. Rao said many things were possible in theory. Celeste said, "So are ghosts, but I do not authenticate them." Rao glanced at her, amused, despite herself. Julian said sarcasm was not evidence. Celeste agreed. Then she asked for ultraviolet light. Under ultraviolet light, the room changed. Repairs glowed. Overpaint darkened. The surface became a map of decisions made by hands across decades. Celeste pointed out her own small restoration and 3 later interventions meant to obscure it. Julian disputed the interpretation until Rao quietly confirmed the sequence. Malcolm's jaw tightened. To him, this was becoming less about truth and more about being used. Celeste saw that and understood both its usefulness and its limit. A small bulge appeared along the inner edge of the lower frame. Rao removed a sliver of loosened backing with tweezers and found a folded scrap pressed into the gap. It might have been overlooked forever if the frame had remained sealed. On the paper was a string of letters and numbers. Celeste felt recognition before she could name it. Museum storage codes had a rhythm, like addresses in a city you once knew. This code belonged to the old conservation wing. Malcolm asked what it meant. Celeste explained that conservation works were logged by department, rack, tray, and treatment sequence. This code did not belong to the woman by the winter window. It belonged to a crate registered the week before the fire. Julian said obsolete codes could be misread. Dr. Rao asked how he knew the code was obsolete without checking. The room became quiet. Julian's face remained composed, but the composure now looked applied, like varnish hiding damage. The code led to a memory Celeste had tried to bury because no one believed it. The night before the fire, she had seen an unfamiliar shipping crate near the restoration corridor. It bore the name Astor Hall Imports, a company she had never seen in museum paperwork. When she asked a registrar, the woman looked nervous and said Julian had authorized a donor transfer. After the fire, that registrar resigned. Months later, she moved overseas. Celeste had written the name in a notebook no investigator requested. Malcolm's archivist, Nora Bell, was summoned to search acquisition files. Nora was 28, precise, and visibly frightened of every person in the room except the painting. She had worked for Malcolm for 2 years, cataloging purchases that arrived with thick files and thin explanations. When Celeste mentioned Astor Hall Imports, Nora's face changed. Julian saw it. Malcolm saw Julian see it. "Speak," Malcolm said. Nora looked at the floor before answering. Astor Hall had appeared in several provenance chains, Nora said, not as a seller of record, but as a storage agent, shipping intermediary, and occasional guarantor. Its paperwork always arrived complete, yet somehow always too complete, as if someone had anticipated questions before they were asked. Nora had flagged inconsistencies twice. Victor told her private collections operated differently from public museums. Julian advised her not to confuse clerical discomfort with evidence of crime. Celeste recognized the shape of Nora's silence. It was the silence of someone young enough to know truth, poor enough to fear rent, and close enough to power to understand how easily a career could be broken. She did not blame her. Blame was another tool the powerful used, dropping it downward until the person holding the least authority carried the most guilt. Celeste asked Nora whether any other works from the museum fire had passed through Astor Hall. Nora hesitated, then nodded. They moved to the archive room beneath the gallery, where temperature-controlled cabinets held folders more valuable than most houses. Provenance was supposed to be a biography of ownership. In Malcolm's collection, it often read like an alibi. Names appeared briefly, vanished into trusts, resurfaced under shell companies, and became respectable after enough signatures. Celeste watched Malcolm read the files and begin to understand that money had not made him master of the room. It had made him useful. 2 other paintings from the fire appeared indirectly in files connected to buyers invited to the private auction. One had gone to a shipping magnate with a museum wing named after his wife. Another had passed through a foundation controlled by a family famous for funding university lectures about cultural heritage. Celeste wanted to laugh, but the sound would have broken something inside her. The public had lost art. The wealthy had inherited ghosts. Julian changed tactics. He stopped arguing facts and began managing consequence. He told Malcolm that public accusation would damage everyone, including innocent collectors. He told Nora she might be liable for mishandled records. He told Dr. Rao that premature statements could ruin her firm. Then he turned to Celeste and said, "You most of all should understand what happens when narratives outrun evidence." It was a beautiful sentence, sharp enough to bleed without leaving fingerprints. Malcolm asked everyone to leave except Celeste. In the empty gallery, he stood before the painting and confessed, without calling it confession. He had not asked enough questions when Julian offered access. He had liked owning what others could not. He had believed secrecy increased value. He had thought himself too intelligent to be deceived by men who flattered him. Celeste listened. She did not comfort him. Rich men's shame often arrived expecting service. He offered her a private resolution. He would compensate her generously. He would hire independent experts. He would correct the record quietly. If appropriate, he would make an anonymous restitution to the museum. Celeste heard the careful architecture of the proposal. It restored his control, reduced her risk, saved his guests, and allowed Julian's network time to seal itself. It also gave her more money than she had ever seen written beside her name. For one breath, she imagined saying yes. She imagined paying every bill, leaving cleaning work, renting a place with sunlight, buying flowers for her mother's grave without counting coins. She imagined a letter from Malcolm's attorneys stating she had provided valuable information. Not innocence, not apology, valuable information. After 15 years of being treated as damage, even that sounded like shelter. Then she looked at the woman by the winter window. The painted woman still sat with hands folded, still holding back speech. Celeste thought about the museum visitors who had stood before that canvas when it belonged to the city. Students, nurses, tired men escaping rain. Her mother, perhaps, on a day Celeste worked late, art in public rooms did not ask whether someone could afford to be moved. Behind Malcolm's locked doors, it became another trophy in a contest without witnesses. No, Celeste said. Malcolm's eyebrows rose, as if refusal were a language he had studied but rarely heard. She explained that the museum must be notified publicly, the fire file reopened, and every Astor Hall transaction examined. Malcolm said exposure would create lawsuits, humiliation, and loss. Celeste said loss had already happened. The only question was whether it would remain assigned to the people least able to defend themselves. Malcolm grew cold. He reminded her that Julian would destroy her credibility. He reminded her the official record still carried her name as negligent. He reminded her that a cleaner accusing collectors of trafficking stolen art would be called unstable before anyone called her brave. Celeste said, "I know. They practiced on me first." That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. The next day, Julian struck. The first article appeared online before breakfast. Disgraced former restorer disrupts private sale. It included Celeste's old photograph from the museum staff page, cropped badly, and repeated allegations from the fire investigation without noting who benefited from them. By noon, commentators asked whether bitterness had driven her to harassment. By evening, someone had found her cleaning company and posted reviews, calling her dangerous near valuables. Celeste's supervisor suspended her pending clarification. The words sounded almost gentle. Her building manager slipped a newspaper clipping under her door, perhaps as warning, perhaps as cruelty. On the train, she noticed a woman reading the article and glancing at her uniform. Shame returned with the old familiarity of a coat pulled from storage. It still fit. That frightened her most. Nora came to Celeste's apartment that night carrying a folder under her raincoat. She had never been to that part of the city and tried not to show fear in the stairwell. Celeste opened the door but did not invite her in until Nora said, "I copied the files before Victor locked me out." On the kitchen table, Nora spread shipping records, email printouts, insurance summaries, and photographs of crate labels. The paper smelled faintly of the archive, dry and expensive. Nora apologized for not speaking sooner. Celeste poured tea because apology is easier to hear when hands have something to do. Nora explained that Julian had routed works through Astor Hall for years. Sometimes the same painting changed titles slightly. Sometimes dimensions shifted by fractions. Sometimes a work listed as privately held had no owner before appearing in a climate-controlled warehouse. The pattern did not prove everything, but it showed intention. Intention was where crimes breathed. One email mattered most. It referred to winter inventory, donor pressure, and 3 assets requiring narrative closure after the fire. Narrative closure. Celeste read the phrase again and felt sick. Her destroyed life had been a line item in someone's plan. Julian had not merely blamed her after an accident. He had built an accident around blame. Nora touched the edge of the paper and whispered that Malcolm needed to see this. Celeste said Malcolm needed to choose whether seeing changed anything. They planned carefully. Going to the police without museum support could bury the case in technical uncertainty. Going to Malcolm alone could return control to private lawyers. Going directly to media risked turning Celeste into spectacle before evidence was secure. Nora knew the City Museum had a new director, Amara Singh, who had been hired to rebuild public trust after unrelated donor scandals. Dr. Rao agreed, cautiously, to verify technical findings if contacted officially. The next public art gala at the museum was 3 nights away. The gala mattered because Julian would receive an award there for lifetime stewardship. Celeste found that word again and again in the program. Stewardship, service, preservation. Beneath the polished language was the same insult Victor had given her in the gallery. Some people were allowed to preserve culture publicly, while others preserved it silently and were discarded when convenient. Celeste decided the truth should return to the place where the lie had begun. Malcolm resisted at first. When Celeste and Nora confronted him with the copied records, he accused Nora of theft and Celeste of manipulating an employee. Then he read the email about narrative closure. His anger changed direction. It did not become virtue. It became self-recognition. He understood that Julian had treated him the way Malcolm had treated companies, workers, and rivals for years, as a useful vessel for someone else's gain. That humiliation opened a door conscience had not managed to open. Celeste asked whether he would testify that the painting had been in his possession and supplied by Julian. Malcolm said public admission could damage his collection permanently. Celeste said stolen things deserved to damage collections. He looked at her for a long time. "You speak as if you have nothing left to lose," he said. Celeste answered, "No, I speak as someone who learned losing everything is not the same as being empty." The night of the museum gala arrived with rain shining on the steps. Limousines lined the curb. Donors emerged beneath umbrellas held by other people. Inside, the atrium glowed with speeches, flowers, and banners celebrating heritage. Celeste entered through the front doors for the first time in 15 years. No one stopped her because Nora had arranged a guest pass through Dr. Rao. Still, every step felt borrowed until she saw the marble staircase where her mother had once stood waving. She wore a plain black dress and carried her old restoration gloves in a small envelope. They were not useful anymore. Cotton had largely been replaced for many tasks, and the fingertips were yellowed with age. But they reminded her that before the world called her negligent, her hands had been trusted. Nora walked beside her with the file. Dr. Rao waited near the side hall. Malcolm stood across the atrium, surrounded by collectors, looking less certain than any billionaire likes to appear. Julian took the stage to applause. He spoke beautifully about cultural memory, public access, and the sacred duty to protect fragile objects from time. Celeste stood in the back and listened to the man who had buried her beneath those same words. When he accepted the award, the museum director invited final remarks from distinguished guests. Malcolm stepped forward before he could change his mind. The room quieted because wealth has its own microphone even before sound systems are turned on. He said there were questions about a painting in his collection. He said Dr. Rao had identified irregularities, requiring public review. He said records connected to Astor Hall imports suggested works believed destroyed in the museum fire might have survived. He did not say enough. He protected himself with careful verbs. But he opened the door. Celeste walked through it. At first, security moved to block her. Amara Singh, the museum director, raised a hand and let her approach. Celeste placed the envelope of gloves on the podium. The audience murmured as recognition spread from old articles, whispers, and Julian's stiffening face. Celeste introduced herself without apology. "My name is Celeste Warren. 15 years ago, I was blamed for the fire that supposedly destroyed the woman by the winter window and 2 other works from this museum. Tonight I am asking you to look at what survived." She did not perform outrage. Outrage would have been easier to dismiss. She presented details: the green restoration mark, the gray thread behind the stretcher, the storage code found in the frame, Astor Hall shipping records, the email about narrative closure. Dr. Rao confirmed the technical findings. Nora confirmed the archive trail. Malcolm, under the gaze of the room, confirmed the painting had been offered to him through Julian's private network. Each confirmation struck the room like a nail being driven into polished wood. Julian tried to recover by attacking process. He said documents could be misread, memories contaminated, private transfers misunderstood. He said Celeste had a personal motive. That was the old blade. Celeste finally turned toward him. "Yes," she said. "I have a personal motive. My life was used to close your narrative, but the evidence does not become false because the person carrying it has suffered." The sentence landed harder than anger, because it left him nowhere clean to stand. Amara Singh announced that the museum would reopen the fire investigation and request legal review of all works linked to Astor Hall. Reporters, present for the gala but not expecting history to split open, began recording. Julian stepped from the stage, but 2 museum security officers and an investigator from the Cultural Property Unit met him near the side door. He was not dragged away. Powerful men rarely are. He was escorted with professional courtesy, which somehow made his defeat colder. The days after the gala were louder than Celeste expected. News vans parked outside her building until neighbors complained. Former colleagues called with voices thick with apology and self-protection. Articles that once described her as disgraced now called her wronged, brilliant, overlooked. The speed of transformation made her distrusted. Public opinion had the attention span of a match flame. It could illuminate or burn, but it rarely stayed warm. The museum issued a formal statement acknowledging grave failures in the original investigation. It did not name every cowardice. Institutions prefer passive voice when shame requires a subject. Still, Celeste read the statement 3 times. Her name appeared beside the word, exonerated. She had imagined that word for 15 years. When it finally arrived, it was smaller than grief and larger than she could hold. She cried not because the word healed everything, but because her mother had not lived to read it. Malcolm invited her back to the estate. This time, the front gate opened before her taxi stopped. Victor was gone. Ellis met her at the door and nodded with a respect that did not require performance. In the gallery, the wall where the woman by the winter window had hung was empty. Malcolm offered Celeste a position as Director of Provenance Review and Restoration Oversight for his entire collection. The salary was extraordinary. The title was the kind that once would have saved her. Celeste looked around the private gallery. She saw better lighting, better security, better climate control than many public museums could afford. She also saw locked doors. She told Malcolm she would not become a decorative conscience for a collection built on secrecy. If he wanted her help, the terms would be different. Every disputed work would be open to independent review. Any public property would be returned. Funds would support conservation training for students without family wealth. Records would be accessible to scholars, not hidden behind hospitality rooms. Malcolm listened with the expression of a man being charged a price he could afford but did not enjoy paying. He asked whether this was punishment. Celeste said no. Punishment would be easier. This was repair. Repair required patience, humility, and visible seams. Restorers knew that the goal was not always to make damage disappear. Sometimes the honest work was to stabilize what remained and ensure the wound could no longer spread. The first returned work was The Woman by the Winter Window. Its arrival at the City Museum drew a crowd larger than any gala. There were school groups, retired guards, former museum staff, neighborhood families, reporters, and people who had never before attended an opening because openings had never seemed meant for them. Celeste stood near the back. She wanted the painting to enter before she did. It had spent 15 years in captivity. It deserved the room first. The new exhibition was titled, What Was Never Lost. Amara asked Celeste to help shape it, and this time Celeste said yes, not as Malcolm's employee, not as Julian's victim. As a conservator returned to public work, the exhibition did not hide the scandal in footnotes. It traced the labor behind preservation. Registrars, handlers, cleaners, guards, apprentices, restorers, archivists, and all the invisible hands that keep beauty from collapsing while others pose beside it. Nora became director of transparent records for the museum's restitution project. Dr. Rao led the technical review. Malcolm attended the opening but stood behind the crowd, where donors unused to background positions shifted uneasily. He had given money because court pressure and public scrutiny left few alternatives, but he also gave documents that helped recover other works. Celeste did not need to decide whether that made him good. Human beings were rarely restored with one clean layer. In the conservation lab, Celeste held a fine brush again. Her hands trembled the first morning, and she hated that. A young intern pretended not to notice, then asked a careful question about varnish blooming. Celeste answered. The answer came from somewhere untouched by the years of floors and vending machines and service doors. Knowledge had not left her. It had waited, folded under ash. She visited her mother's grave after the exhibition opened. The cemetery was small, bordered by apartment buildings and a bus line. Celeste brought no expensive flowers, only white lilies from a corner shop Lorna had liked. She placed the museum statement beside the stone for a moment, then laughed at herself and took it back before rain could ruin it. They wrote it down, Mama, she said. Not perfectly, but they wrote it down. The final room of What Was Never Lost held the painting alone, not behind velvet ropes meant to flatter wealth, but at a distance that allowed anyone to stand and look. Beside it, a small panel described the false fire record, the recovery, and the restoration mark that helped identify it. Celeste insisted the panel mention the mark without romanticizing her. It was not magic. It was skill. It was labor. It was proof that careful work leaves traces even when power tries to erase them. On the busiest day of the exhibition, Celeste saw a cleaner pause near the doorway with a cart, trying to look without seeming to look. The guard began to tell her to move along, then stopped when he saw Celeste watching. Celeste crossed the room and said, "You can come in. The floor can wait 5 minutes." The woman looked startled, then grateful, then suspicious of her own gratitude. Celeste understood. Permission, when long denied, can feel like a trap. They stood together before the woman by the winter window. The cleaner said she did not know anything about art. Celeste replied that looking was a beginning, not a privilege. The woman's eyes moved over the blue sleeve, the folded hands, the winter glass. After a while, she said the woman in the painting looked like she had been waiting for someone to believe her. Celeste felt her throat tighten. "Yes," she said. I think she was. Years would pass before every Astor Hall transaction was untangled. Some works returned. Some disappeared deeper into private vaults. Some collectors fought until legal fees became another wall. Julian's trial moved slowly, delayed by illness claims, procedural motions, and the expensive patience of defense attorneys. Celeste testified more than once. Each time, his lawyers tried to turn her suffering into bias. Each time, she answered with facts. The city changed the museum's policies because embarrassment can accomplish what ethics postpones. Conservation records became harder to seal. Donor transfers required independent review. Staff from working-class backgrounds received paid training instead of unpaid opportunities disguised as prestige. None of it was enough. Repair never is. But enough doors opened for people behind Celeste to enter without crawling through the service corridor. Celeste kept her cleaning uniform folded in a drawer. Not as shame, not as costume, and not as proof that humble work made her noble. She kept it because every life has evidence, and that gray shirt had carried her through years when the world confused silence with absence. Sometimes she unfolded it before lectures and remembered Victor saying people like her were not paid to understand the things on walls. Then she walked into classrooms and taught students how to read damage. What she taught first was not technique. It was responsibility. A painting could be stolen with documents as easily as with knives. A worker could be erased with reputation as easily as with fire. A wealthy collector could call himself a steward while locking public memory behind private glass. And a tiny repair, made by a hand no one respected, could survive long enough to accuse everyone who looked away. In the final scene of her own remembering, Celeste often returned to that night in Malcolm's gallery. The laughter. The guards. Julian saying her name like a warning. The painting under light it was never meant to see. She no longer imagined herself smaller in that room. She imagined the room smaller around the truth. It had been full of money, but money had not known where to look. The woman by the winter window remained quiet, as paintings do. Yet people came to it with their own silences. Some saw loneliness. Some saw endurance. Some saw theft returned. Celeste saw all of that, and also a green dot beneath blue shadow, nearly invisible, holding its place across smoke, lies, auctions, lawsuits, and time. It reminded her that restoration is not resurrection. It is the refusal to let damage have the final word. After the gala, the museum did not become honest overnight. Honesty in large institutions moves through committees, and committees move at the speed of self-protection. Amara Singh invited Celeste into a closed review room with lawyers, insurers, trustees, archivists, and people who had never spent 10 minutes in a conservation lab but still spoke as if they owned the word preservation. They wanted dates, signatures, and careful language. Celeste gave them facts and refused to let careful language become another curtain. The original fire report arrived in 3 heavy binders. Celeste had dreamed of seeing it for years, but when the pages lay open, she felt no triumph. She felt the old helplessness of being turned into paperwork. There was her name, repeated in witness summaries, risk notes, and internal memoranda. There were places where her statements had been shortened until they sounded uncertain. There were places where Julian's statements had been expanded until speculation looked like expertise. One line held her for several minutes. It stated that Celeste Warren could not confirm the location of the woman by the winter window before the fire reached the restoration corridor. She remembered saying the opposite. She remembered begging the investigator to check the transfer log. The investigator's notes, attached in an appendix no one had cited, showed her original words clearly. The report had not misunderstood her. It had chosen a cleaner version of events. Amara watched Celeste read that page. The museum director was not sentimental, but her anger had a disciplined quality Celeste respected. She said the institution had confused survival with truth. Celeste answered that institutions often survived by letting individuals drown. No one in the room corrected her. Even the lawyers kept their eyes down, as if the table had become suddenly interesting. Dr. Rao's technical report deepened the case. The painting had not been exposed to direct flame. Microscopic soot lay in cracks consistent with a brief passage through smoke, not destruction in a burning room. Later, cleaning had removed most surface residue, but traces remained beneath overpaint. The frame had been altered twice after the fire. The lining repair Celeste described predated those alterations. The evidence was slow, exact, and merciless. Nora built the ownership map, She worked in a borrowed office at the museum, surrounded by photocopies, string tags, shipping manifests, and cups of coffee gone cold. Celeste helped when her memory could place old museum codes beside new corporate names. Astor Hall Imports appeared in London, Geneva, Delaware, and the Bahamas, never quite as the same entity, always close enough to vanish into legality. Each shell company was a door opening onto another door. Malcolm sent files because public pressure made secrecy expensive, but he also began sending questions. At first they were defensive. Could a collector be responsible for fraud he did not knowingly commit? Could restitution be arranged without admitting criminal negligence? Could anonymous return protect innocent families? Celeste answered only the questions worth answering. Responsibility, she wrote once, begins the moment comfort depends on not knowing. That sentence later appeared in a newspaper profile without her permission. She hated that. Reporters wanted her to become a symbol because symbols require less complexity than people. They asked whether she forgave Malcolm. They asked whether she hated Julian. They asked whether poverty had made her stronger. Celeste learned to say that poverty had made many things harder, and other people should stop decorating hardship after benefiting from it. Julian's supporters did what supporters of polished men often do. They praised his generosity, his lectures, his mentorship, his taste. They asked whether a man of such refinement could really have designed a fraud that destroyed a young restorer. Celeste found the question almost funny. Refinement had never prevented cruelty. Sometimes it simply taught cruelty where to stand, how to dress, and which fork to use at dinner. One retired registrar finally came forward. Her name was Miriam Vale, and she had signed the transfer slip for the crate Celeste remembered. Miriam had kept silent after the fire because her husband was ill, her pension was near, and Julian told her she would be blamed for unauthorized movement of insured works. She met Celeste in a quiet cafe and cried before ordering coffee. Celeste wanted to be angry. Instead, she felt the enormous sadness of seeing another life bent by fear. Miriam brought a copy of the transfer slip, folded inside a hymnal for 15 years. It named Astor Hall as temporary storage for 3 works scheduled for private donor inspection. Julian's initials appeared beside the authorization. The date was the day before the fire. The museum's public records said no such transfer occurred. The slip did not answer every question, but it cut through years of fog like a blade catching sunlight. Celeste asked Miriam why she kept it. Miriam said she thought someday someone would need proof that the museum had not simply made a mistake. Then she looked at Celeste and whispered, "I should have helped you." Celeste did not offer quick absolution. She had learned that forgiveness given too fast can become another way of protecting the guilty from discomfort. She said, "Help now." Miriam nodded. That was enough for the moment. The Cultural Property Unit opened a formal case. Detectives visited Malcolm's estate, Astor Hall offices, storage warehouses, and 2 private homes whose owners suddenly discovered urgent reasons to travel abroad. Crates were opened. Paintings were photographed under sterile light. Lawyers argued over jurisdiction. Insurance firms tried to determine whether they had been deceived, complicit, or merely careless enough to look complicit. The machinery of consequence finally began moving. Celeste was asked to consult, but she insisted on a written contract with transparent pay. For years, people had requested her memory as if it were a favor owed to the world that had abandoned her. Not this time. Her knowledge had value. Her labor had value. Her time had value. When the museum accountant looked surprised by her rate, Amara said, "Pay it." Celeste did not smile until she reached the elevator. The first time she entered the conservation lab again, she stopped at the threshold. The room had changed. New tables, new ventilation, different lamps, younger faces. Yet the smell of paper, linen, solvent, and careful dust struck her so hard she had to place one hand against the wall. A technician asked whether she needed water. Celeste said no. She needed 10 seconds to stand inside the life she had been told was over. A damaged landscape linked to Astor Hall lay on the table. It was not one of the 3 fire paintings, but its false history had passed through the same hands. Celeste examined the surface with Dr. Rao beside her. Their methods differed, but their respect for evidence matched. Under magnification, Celeste found a retouching pattern consistent with Julian's preferred private restorer. The man had a habit of hiding losses by making them too smooth. That vanity became evidence. Meanwhile, Malcolm began losing invitations. A collector who had toasted him at the private auction stopped returning calls. A museum board postponed naming a room after him. Financial papers described his collection as contaminated, which irritated him more than moral criticism ever could. He complained to Celeste once that he was being treated like a criminal. She answered that discomfort was not injustice. He did not speak to her for 2 weeks. When he returned, he brought a list of works he was willing to surrender for review. Celeste read it and noticed several obvious omissions. She circled them in red. Malcolm said those were acquired before Julian. Celeste said secrecy was not purified by age. He accused her of wanting to dismantle the whole collection. She answered that collections built honestly could survive questions. Ones that could not survive questions had already confessed. Their conflict became a strange form of education. Malcolm learned the difference between ownership and stewardship only because Celeste refused to let him borrow noble words without paying their cost. Celeste learned that powerful allies were useful only when watched carefully. Trust, like restoration, could not be rushed. If pressure was applied too quickly, old fractures widened. Nora changed as well. At first she apologized before every statement. Then she began bringing charts, timelines, and corrections with a steadiness that reminded Celeste of someone learning to stand in shoes that finally fit. Victor had taught Nora to doubt discomfort. Celeste taught her to examine it. In archives, discomfort often points to the shelf someone hopes you will not open. The lawsuit from Julian's attorneys arrived on a Thursday. Defamation, interference, reputational harm. The language was designed to exhaust. Celeste's hands shook while reading it, not because she believed he would win, but because legal paper had once helped bury her. Amara connected her with counsel. Malcolm, after a visible struggle between self-interest and decency, agreed to fund the defense without controlling it. Celeste accepted only after the agreement stated that no donor would direct legal strategy. Depositions reopened old wounds with fluorescent lighting. Julian's lawyer asked whether Celeste resented successful men. He asked whether financial stress affected her memory. He asked whether cleaning houses for wealthy clients had created an emotional hostility toward collectors. Celeste answered each question plainly. When he asked if she considered herself objective, she said, "No witness is without a life. That is why we bring evidence." The court reporter looked up for half a second, then returned to typing. The most difficult deposition was not Julian's, it was Miriam's. The retired registrar's voice shook as she described the transfer, the threat, and the years of silence. Julian's lawyer pressed until she cried. Celeste watched from across the table, remembering all the times she had imagined confronting those who failed her. The reality was less satisfying. Miriam was not a monster. She was a frightened person who had made fear useful to a monster. Afterward, Miriam found Celeste in the hallway and said she did not expect forgiveness. Celeste said expectation was wise. Then she added, "Softer." That testimony mattered. Miriam nodded as if accepting a sentence. Celeste realized justice would not arrive as one clean feeling. It came in mixed colors, with sediments of grief, anger, relief, and unfinished mercy. The recovered painting underwent careful treatment before exhibition. Celeste did not remove every sign of its captivity. She and Dr. Rao agreed that some traces should remain documented, because history cleaned too perfectly becomes another lie. The green dot stayed. The gray thread stayed in the record. The slight abrasion from its years in private hands was stabilized but not disguised. Viewers deserved to know survival had cost something. When students visited the lab, Celeste showed them photographs of the painting under normal light, raking light, ultraviolet light, and infrared reflectography. She asked what changed when tools changed. A student said the truth became visible. Celeste corrected her gently. "Some truths become visible," she said. "Others require someone to ask why they were hidden." That became the sentence students quoted most. The cleaning company offered Celeste her job back after the scandal turned in her favor. The manager said it with pride, as if generosity had occurred. Celeste thanked him and declined. Then she asked whether the suspended pay would be released. He looked surprised. She waited. The check arrived 2 weeks later. It was not much, but principal rarely arrives in large denominations. Ellis visited the museum on his day off wearing a suit that did not quite fit. He stood before the painting for a long time, then told Celeste his wife had made him come because he had talked about the case every night. He apologized for keeping her in the staff lounge under Malcolm's order. Celeste told him he had not mocked her. Sometimes, in rooms built on contempt, refusing to mock someone is the first small rebellion, Amara asked Celeste to speak at the exhibition opening. Celeste refused twice. She did not want to become a performance of pain for donors seeking moral cleanliness. On the third request, Amara changed the audience. The first speech would be for museum staff before the public opening. Guards, cleaners, preparators, ticket clerks, registrars, educators, interns, and conservators. Celeste said yes. She stood before them on a Monday morning while coffee cooled in paper cups. She said the museum had failed not only because one man lied, but because too many systems preferred a convenient story. She said expertise can wear a uniform, carry keys, push carts, or speak with an accent donors do not recognize. She said the next Celeste Warren should not need a stolen painting to be believed. No one applauded at first. Then one guard began, and the sound grew until Celeste had to look down. The staff speech changed the exhibition more than the donor gala. Guards began adding their own memories to internal reports. A ticket clerk remembered a visitor asking about the missing winter painting years earlier and being told the file was closed. A preparator found an old crate photograph in a forgotten training folder. None of these fragments alone could convict anyone, but together they showed how truth survives in ordinary people who are never asked the right questions. Celeste started a weekly workshop in the museum's smallest classroom. She expected 5 students. 20 came the first night, including a dishwasher from the cafe, a frame shop assistant, 2 community college students, a retired house painter, and a woman who cleaned offices in the financial district. Celeste placed damaged practice panels on the tables and told them conservation was not a mystery reserved for wealthy children with museum internships. It was discipline, humility, chemistry, history, and care. She made them begin with looking, 10 minutes of silence before touching anything. Some found it uncomfortable. People trained to serve are often punished for pausing, and looking can feel like theft when the world teaches you nothing beautiful is yours. Celeste understood. She told them that attention is not ownership. Attention is respect. Then she showed them how a crack widens, how grime settles, how bad repair pretends to be rescue. One student asked whether Celeste wished she had shouted louder 15 years earlier. The question was innocent and cruel in the way innocent questions can be. Celeste considered lying. Instead, she said she had shouted as loudly as she knew how, but volume does not matter when a room has decided which voices count as noise. The work now was not to teach the wounded to scream better. It was to change the room. Malcolm attended one workshop from the back, clearly uncomfortable among folding chairs and plastic trays. Celeste did not introduce him. For once, he had to stand without being announced. Afterward, he admitted he had never thought about who maintained the objects he bought. He knew artists' names, dealers' names, and auction prices, but not the technicians who kept canvases from splitting in winter. Celeste said that was the point. Wealth often mistakes the final invoice for the whole history. The second recovered fire painting was found in a private medical foundation's boardroom, hanging behind a table where grants were denied with polite regret. Its title had been changed, its dimensions rounded, and its old frame replaced. Celeste identified it from a damaged underdrawing visible in infrared. When it came down from the wall, one board member said the room looked empty without it. Celeste thought about the museum wall that had been empty for 15 years and said nothing. The third painting took longer. It had passed through 2 trusts and disappeared into a mountain estate owned by a family whose fortune came from prisons. Their lawyers argued that public display would endanger the work, although private neglect had already warped the panel. The court ordered examination. Celeste traveled with Dr. Rao through snow to inspect it. When the crate opened, the smell of cold wood and old varnish rose like testimony. That painting was nearly ruined. Poor storage had caused lifting paint along the lower edge, and an amateur repair had smeared a saint's hand into a pale blur. Celeste felt anger so sharp it steadied her. The work had been stolen from the public in the name of preservation, then harmed by the very people who claimed to save it. She spent 3 months helping stabilize it, refusing every request to rush before the press conference. During those months, Celeste finally moved from the apartment above the closed tailor shop. She did not move to a grand place. She chose a small apartment with morning light, a table wide enough for books, and a window overlooking a laundromat where people came and went with baskets of ordinary life. The first night there, she unpacked the shoebox of rejection letters and placed it on a shelf instead of under the bed. Evidence deserved air. She also bought a new pair of restoration gloves, though she no longer used them for most work. They sat beside the old yellowed pair in her drawer. One pair belonged to the woman who believed skill would be enough. The other belonged to the woman who knew skill needed protection. Witnesses, contracts, courage, and community. Celeste loved them both. Neither had survived alone. The last public hearing was held in a city council chamber that smelled of old wood and wet coats. Former museum workers sat beside students, attorneys, donors, and reporters. Celeste spoke for only 5 minutes. She did not repeat every injury. She asked for a permanent fund protecting conservation records, paid apprenticeships, and whistleblower support for cultural workers without financial security. Then she sat down before anyone could turn her life into charity. When the vote passed, the applause felt different from the gala's applause. It came from people who understood wages, rent, fear, and the cost of telling the truth when truth does not pay bills. Celeste accepted it with both feet on the floor. She had not been rescued by the rich. She had carried a piece of evidence through fire, humiliation, and time until the world finally had to look. Years later, when people asked what had saved the painting, Celeste never said luck. She said a worker had touched it carefully, remembered it honestly, and refused to let expensive rooms decide what counted as truth. Then she would guide them closer to the blue sleeve, close enough to see the small green mark. It was barely visible. That was why it mattered. Power had missed it because power never expects the overlooked to leave evidence. It waited there, patient, plain, and impossible to buy or bury again now.